Welcome back to Among the Latest Hobbies. Today, I'm going to show you how I painted Gildor. It's a really nice model. I realize he went to Legends recently, but that's not going to stop us. We're going to start on his cloak. I used Mechanica Standard Gray because I want the outer tunic or cloak to have more of a gray vibe to it. I prefer to use air models on air paints whenever I can, because frankly I'm pretty lazy and I don't like thinning down my paints. So it does take more coats than you might be used to whenever you use air paints, but the benefit to that is you can just paint them straight from the pot, which is what I prefer to do when possible. So it will take, when using an air paint straight from the pot, about, especially when going over a black primer, 4 coats, I would say 3 to 4 coats. So, and because his outer cloak is the largest and most visible part of the model, this was the most time-consuming part of the model. And now, next step, I'm going to use Caliban green on the tunic, inner cloak. Not quite sure what to call this part. As we all know, elves love the color green. So I couldn't help but use a little bit of green on this model. And for the tertiary color, I used the Fang. That's going to be on his little arm guards here. He's got some vambrances, as well as he's got like a third tunic or cloak inside of this outer tunic, which I decided to paint with the Fang. And for his flesh, I decided to use Cadian Flesh Tone. Cadian Flesh Tone is a lighter flesh tone in the Games Workshop line of paints. So I decided to use that because I like to think that elves have a lighter tone of flesh than humans. This is a layer paint, which has a thinner consistency than a base paint, so this will also take 2 to 3 layers, or 2 or 3 coats. For his boots, I used Rhinox hide. For his sword, I used Iron Hand Steel. Now he's in a nice sword drawing motion here, so you don't have to use a whole lot of Iron Hand Steel here, which is a good thing. There is quite a bit of the sword, like actually underneath when you turn it upside down, so don't forget to get all of that. For the scabbard, I used Thondia Brown. I wanted to distinguish it from the color of his boots. And for his hair, I wanted it to be a elven blonde, if that is such a thing. Elven blonde, I'm not sure. But I used XV88 as my base color. I'm going to do a little bit more work on this later to make it look a little more classically elven blonde. So we're starting with XV88. And the final base coating step is for some of the little pieces of gold trim on the model. So that's going to be the little pieces on his scabbard. as well as a little gold brooch he's got that's holding his cloak together. And his belt is also kind of unusually made of gold, not something you normally see on an elven model. He's also got a cord or band that seems to be made of gold that is attaching his belt to the scabbard. It's not necessarily apparent unless you turn the model upside down. So with the base coating done, we're going to start with washes. And we're going to use Nuln Oil to wash both the sword itself as well as the cloak. And for the green bits of cloth, I use Biltan Green. Now, of course, I could have used something like Agrex Earthshade or Nuln Oil, but I really, on an elf, I like for the green to stand out and not get washed out by a black or brown, so I use Biltan Green. Now, for the boots and the scabbard, I used Agrex Earthshade. I also used Agrex Earthshade on his hair. That makes the strands stand out a little bit better when painting a miniature with blonde hair. And for skin, I use Reikland Flesh Shade, focusing especially on the eyes, the cheek area, as well as the fingers. And for the blue parts of cloth, I used Drakenhof Nightshade Wash. And we're done with shading the model. And we're going to move on to highlighting. I used Dawnstone Air to highlight the outer gray cloth. This part did take quite a while because, of course, the outer gray cloth is the biggest part of the model, but it also has quite a bit of folds and so forth. So this part did take quite a while, but it was quite rewarding when it was done. I am using an air paint, which is thinner than a regular paint. So in a few areas, I had to go back and add a second layer of highlighting. But in the end, I did think that the highlight for the gray area ended up looking fairly well. Now for the green areas of the model, I used Warpstone Glow. Warpstone Glow is very, very bright, so you want to be kind of sparing and careful with it. If you go too thick with it, obviously it's going to just look very kind of unnaturally bright on a miniature like this. So you want to put it on as thinly as possible and make sure that you are just hitting those areas of where the light would kind of catch. For his arm braces, I used Rust Gray. And I just kind of put a little highlight on the end of his armbands and on the tips. I also put a little tiny highlight on his little blue cloak area right in between, that falls right in between the two areas of green cloth. I also highlighted his skin with Kislev flesh. Again, because he's an elf, I imagine that his skin is going to be a little bit lighter than a human. I just put highlights on the skin here and the high cheekbones he has, his nose, the above his eyes, top of his forehead, as well as his ears. Now, to actually get kind of more of that blonde look, rather than a dirty blonde look, which is kind of what he has now, I use the Zamisi Desert, and what I like to do is go into some of those individual strands and just highlight some of the strands, not necessarily every strand. If you highlight every single strand, it kind of gives you a weird yellowy look that's kind of unnatural. But if you highlight maybe 30 to 50% of the strands, then it looks a bit more naturally blonde. And the final step will be doing some leather highlights with Gorthor Brown. And I use this to highlight the scabbard as well as the boots. Now on the boots there are some leather straps, so don't forget to pick those out, especially on his right foot. They don't really seem to be as visible on the left boot. I guess they're hidden behind his cloak. So I also added a few just little points of interest here. And there's Gildor done. I added a little bit of basing from Luke's AP Gaming Grass, but I think altogether he turned out pretty well. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video.